I've been really hesitant to share this story, but after reading about other people's experiences, I feel like I need to get this off my chest. I'm not sure if what I encountered was the same thing, but it was definitely something I never want to experience again. For the record, this was in June of 2018, in my small hometown in Alaska. At the time, I was working at a local bar, and so my shifts usually end right around 2 in the morning. Now, I lived about a mile away, and since it was summer, it never really got dark outside. I mean, the sun would set for a few hours, yeah, but there was always a twilight glow in the sky, and it really made walking home after work very nice. A great time and place to clear the head. Anyway, my route home took me through a densely wooded area. There was even a well-worn path that connected the bar to the residential part of town. Now, I'd walked this path countless times and never had any issues prior. But on this night, even though I couldn't visibly see anything, I could feel a strange sense of something wrong as soon as I stepped foot on that path. And as I walked deeper into the area, I could see that there were 2 figures up ahead on the path. But here's the thing. It's not like you're thinking. There weren't monsters. They appeared to be children, a boy and a girl. Both, I would say, probably no older than 12, but no younger than 9. They were standing side by side facing away from me and seemed to be staring at something in the distance. I found it very odd that 2 kids this young would be out here by themselves at this time of night. But I figured it might just be 2 siblings who had snuck out of their house for some late-night adventure. I approached them and I called out, "Hey, are you guys okay? It's pretty late to be out here." They didn't respond or even acknowledge my presence, so I slowed my pace, feeling dread. Something about these kids just didn't seem right. Well, when I was about 20 feet away from them, they finally turned to face me. And that's when I saw their eyes. They weren't completely pitch black like some of the stories I've read, but their pupils were unnaturally large, almost seeming to glow in the dim light. Their expressions were even more horrifying, completely blank, devoid of any emotion or feeling. The boy spoke first, his voice very robotic and monotone, very emotionless. "We need your help. We're lost and need to find our way home." Then the girl chimed in, her voice the exact same. Flat, lifeless, emotionless. "Can you take us to your house? We need to call our parents." That's when I immediately felt my internal organs, my whole body screaming at me to get out of there. Every instinct was telling me there's something very wrong about this situation. But I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "I can't take you to my house, but I can call your parents and if you give me their number." Whereas the boy interrupted and exchanged a glance at the girl, and he said, "No, we need to go to your house. Our parents will be worried." So I just took a step back and I said, "Look, I can't help you. Maybe you should try to find a police officer or something." And with that, I just turned around and began briskly walking away as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. As I quickly picked up my pace and was hurrying down the path, I just couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. And so I glanced back once and just saw them standing in the same spot, their eyes fixated on me. And I kept picking up the pace, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. When I finally reached my home, I locked the door behind me, collapsing on the couch, my heart still racing. I have no idea what they were or who they were. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange and unsettling they were. And why were they out there in the middle of the night, acting so monotone and strange? I think there was something very wrong about the situation. I mean, what do you think? As a cop, I spend a lot of time dealing with things that really bother people. Anyway, as the only deputy out in a remote Alaskan county, I've seen and experienced things I can't rightly explain. This particular incident happened during a frigid Alaskan winter, and it marked my first supernatural encounter during my career. I remember that night quite well. The temperature was well below freezing as I cruised the desolate backroads, my only companion being the blaring heater inside my vehicle. The sky above was filled with brilliant stars, while the ground below was nothing but a vast expanse of snow-covered forests and frozen rivers. Undoubtedly, the landscape was beautiful, but also eerie. I hadn't encountered other people for hours, and since there had not been any incoming calls, I decided to take a break near a frozen lake I'd visited a few times on my patrols. Despite the silence, I could still make out the soft, rhythmic humming of the wind roaring through the trees. It seemed like I had found myself in a whole other world. I parked the vehicle next to the lake, turning off the engine but leaving the heater running. As I scanned the surroundings, my eyes locked onto something right near the edge of the frozen body of water. It was a tall, mysterious figure with eyes that somehow gleamed unnaturally. A sense of terror quickly washed over me that moment. Nonetheless, I managed to force myself to take action. I quickly notified dispatch while holding my gaze on the figure. I grabbed my patrol rifle off its mount. Upon opening the door with a distinct creak, the figure suddenly darted behind a cluster of trees. Foolishly and impulsively, I lunged out of my vehicle to pursue this, my breath forming clouds of mist as I shouted, "Sheriff's Department, stop!" But the figure had already vanished. As I trudged through the snow as fast as I could, I quickly realized how the figure had just fled. The chase led me deeper into the woods, and with each minute, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the growing sense of dread welling up inside me. It felt as though I was trespassing on some unknown territory, unwelcomed and vulnerable. As I navigated through the trees, the crunch of snow beneath my boots echoed eerily throughout the forest. The cold air grew insufferable, biting through my skin. It was then that I noticed a pungent odor, a mix of rotten meat, wet fur, and a nauseating, musky smell that seemed to surround me on all sides. Try as I might, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched by something, or someone. At that point, my adrenaline and courage had vanished, leaving only a sense of sheer panic in their wake. Abandoning my pursuit, I turned back towards my vehicle, not realizing how far I had come. The scent of the putrid odor trailed after me as I stumbled through the snow, and somehow, the forest seemed even darker than before. The lingering dread stayed with me until I finally reached the edge of the woods. I found my vehicle just as I had left it, but the door was now wide open. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked the truck for any signs of intrusion. When the familiar scent hit me, I realized that the creature had been inside my vehicle while I was gone. Panicked, I turned the truck on and sped away, too afraid to linger in the area for even a moment longer. I never spoke about that encounter openly at first, but almost a year later, a colleague of mine told me about a similar experience he had while patrolling a completely different part of the county. He, too, had encountered that same repulsive smell, and he had found an enormous handprint on his vehicle after becoming incredibly frightened. That night marked the beginning of a series of bizarre sightings and incidents in our very county. After sharing our experiences, we couldn't shake the feeling that we're dealing with something entirely unknown and beyond our comprehension. We would even hear rumors of things happening in the Alaskan wilderness, but we could never find any real concrete evidence to back these claims. Our curiosity and fear would continue to grow in tandem. As time went on, I would have several more strange run-ins with this mysterious figure. Each time, I would find myself in a more remote part of the county, drawn in by the heart of the wilderness by some unexplainable force. It was always there waiting for me, as if it was watching me from a distance. In each of these accounts, It seemed to be only interested in observing me, maintaining its distance and eluding any sort of capture. However, it would always leave behind the same foul odor, as if to remind me of its presence. At times, I would hear whispers amongst my fellow law enforcement about other fantastical and horrifying things in the area, but my own fear and disbelief kept me from sharing these. On one particular dark and icy evening, I ventured deep into the wilderness, driven by this mysterious desire to confront this figure once and for all. As I traversed the snow-covered terrain, I was acutely aware of the foreboding silence that enveloped me. As I reached a clearing, I saw it again, standing at the edge. Suddenly, I felt the same overwhelming dread wash over me, and I realized this may not have been a wise decision. Despite my fear, I mustered all my courage and shouting at this thing, demanding that it reveal its purpose and why it had been continuing to torment me for so long. I felt as though I was trapped in some twisted Stephen King novel. The figure remained silent, not even acknowledging me. Then, it just seemed to dissipate in a foamy, white, milky mist. I had asked a fellow officer what he thinks after recounting my experience, and even after watching his eyes widen with fear and disbelief, I'm not exactly sure what he thought. It must not have been good. Now, it's been years since that night, and while I still sometimes hear rumors of strange things going on like Bigfoot or ghosts or even the Kushtaka, I myself have never again had an encounter with this figure or poltergeist. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to read about my experience. Whether or not you believe in the supernatural or the possibility of undiscovered creatures, I hope my story leaves you with a much more open mind than I had. Back in the 90s, I was living in a very remote part of Alaska, located about 30 miles southeast of Fairbanks. I was a sophomore in high school at the time and had recently moved to this area with my family. Our home was situated deep in the heart of the woods, far from civilization, with the nearest neighbor being well over 2 miles away. Gravel roads were the norm, and on moonless nights, the darkness seemed almost impenetrable. Our property was surrounded by dense forests and a single small stream, which contributed to the peaceful and somewhat interesting atmosphere. My family and I began to believe there was something more to this place than we would have initially suspected. This belief was further fortified by an encounter I had with a creature while exploring the woods one evening. It was a brisk fall evening, and I decided to go for a stroll, feeling the need to stretch my legs and acquaint myself with my new environment. The sun had just begun to set. As I continued on my trek, the tranquility of the setting was suddenly shattered by a weird noise that seemed to emerge directly from behind me. Startled, I whipped around to face the source of the disturbance, but found nothing in sight. A feeling of dread crept up in me, but I quickly dismissed the noise as the wind playing tricks on me, and I carried on. Taking a deep breath, I continued my leisurely stroll when the rustling sounds continued, this time coming from somewhere to my right. Peering through the dense foliage, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure swiftly moving between the trees. It appeared to be entirely black, almost as if it were made of shadows. It appeared to be at least 7 feet tall, moving on 2 legs, resembling a massive gorilla. The mere sight of this being sent shivers down my spine and roused a sense of panic. As I stood there, I was frozen in fear. It seemed to be aware of me, pausing to cast a fleeting glance in my direction before then vanishing into the thickets with alarming speed and agility, bound for the direction of the nearby stream. Eventually, I managed to shake myself out of the stupor induced by this strange being and sprinted back towards my home. Upon arriving, I would recount my experience to my family, who were understandably skeptical. In the days that followed, my tension and trepidation were only further exacerbated by 2 additional sightings, both in the vicinity of our home. Despite to understand what I was witnessing, I began to investigate the history of this area, doing anything I could to look for any logical explanations that might shed some insight. Who or what was this entity? Was it simply a wild animal, or was there something more at play here? What's crazy is just 2 weeks later, my neighbor who lived about 2 miles away approached me with a very interesting story. He too had spotted this thing lurking in the woods, concealed amongst the shadows and towering spruce trees. The descriptions of the creature from both stories were uncannily similar, so much so that it seemed unlikely to be a mere coincidence or a case of overactive imagination. The sightings would continue over the next few months, with brief encounters and tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. Winter would eventually progress, the occurrences would begin to dissipate and eventually cease altogether. It left my family and me to wonder if we would ever really find out what it was. Now, it's been years since then, and I reside in a more populated area of Alaska. I admit that my curiosity has never waned, and sometimes I really do wonder about the whole mystery of Bigfoot. So I thought I would post this story here, and you guys tell me what you think. Is there a real logical explanation to this, or did my family and I genuinely come face to face with something beyond our understanding? I'm not exactly sure what this thing's intentions were in the Alaskan woods, but one thing is clear: I have no desire to deal with this again. Last summer, my girlfriend and I went on a road trip through the wilderness of Alaska. My girlfriend, who has a deep interest in nature, suggested that we visit Denali National Park. For the most part, everything was going smoothly. But then something strange occurred one evening that left both of us feeling shaken and unsure of what happened. I'm sharing my story here to see if anyone can help us make sense of what we experienced during that night in the Alaskan wilderness. Our trip began in Anchorage, where we rented an RV and ventured towards Denali. Of course, with it being Alaska, the journey was filled with breathtaking views and a sense of adventure. After stopping at several scenic points, we reached our campsite, located right near the edge of the park. The sun was setting, and it dipped right below the snow-capped mountains. It made the entire landscape change. So once we settled in, my girlfriend and I spotted a perfect spot to set up a small campfire. We spent some time gathering firewood, building a small pit, and soon enough had a crackling fire. We cooked dinner, enjoying each other's company. Feeling the warmth from the fire and listening to the night does a bit of good to the human soul. When we finished eating, we put out the fire and decided to stargaze for a little while. Considering the vast wilderness of Denali National Park, the night sky was incomparably dark, filled with a blanket of twinkling stars. Lying in the grass next to each other, we marveled at the immense beauty of the universe and pointed out various constellations to one another. As we gazed at the stars, I suddenly felt an odd sensation. Something wasn't right. Now, I brushed it off as a product of my active imagination and just continued staring. And my girlfriend poked me in the arm and whispered to me, frantically, "Do you hear that?" I focused my attention, and indeed, there were some odd noises emanating from the surrounding woods. It was difficult to describe the sounds, though. Not quite a growl, but not a typical forest critter either. We tried to chalk it up to an unknown animal, but it still continued. Then we see something. A slow, deliberate movement in the darkness caught my peripheral vision. So I whispered back to my girlfriend, "Do you see that?" And she would nod her eyes wide with fear. Whatever it was seemed very reluctant to come into the direct light of our campsite, but appeared to be pacing back and forth at the tree line. This thing had a very unusual appearance, and I say it because it was not an animal. It was tall, lanky, and seemingly hairless, reflecting an unsettling pale hue in the dim light. but it walked on two legs, which was disturbing given its apparent size. It moved like a person, but with deliberate, graceful motion that seemed nearly predatory. My girlfriend and I had no idea what to do. We quickly gathered our belongings and retreated to the safety of our RV, locking the door behind us. We would hear these strange sounds outside, but it never approached the vehicle. Eventually, after what I would describe as heart-pounding moments, the sounds only grew more and more faint until stopping. The following morning, we cautiously ventured out to survey the area. The only remnants of our encounter was a series of strange, elongated footprints right around the perimeter of the campsite. These prints lacked any sort of real definition, no discernible claws or pads, just the bald impressions of this thing's feet. We didn't know what to make of the entire ordeal, but one thing was clear: we wanted out. And somehow my girlfriend convinced me that we should stay another night and that things would be fine. Where I, on the other hand, felt it was better to leave and not take any chances. In the end, we compromised and decided to move our campsite further into the park, hoping we would avoid any further encounters. Well, that evening, we kept a watchful eye on our surroundings, feeling both fascinated and terrified. Fortunately for us, nothing else really happened, and I'm thankful for that. But I still wonder what it could have been and what it is that we came across. I'm not really a big one to entertain the idea of monsters in the woods because it seems ridiculous, but come on, can someone help me out here and figure out what this was? When I was around 10 years old, I lived in a very small town in Alaska, just kind of tucked away among the trees and mountains. This wasn't exactly a tourist destination. It was a more tight-knit community where everyone knew their neighbors, and our entertainment came from reading books, listening to the radio, or even exploring and playing in the woods around us. I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was an evening in October, just a few weeks away before the snow would start falling, and this is when I went out to go play. I wanted to enjoy the last remnants of daylight, which would flood the sky. My family had a cabin just a few miles down a seldom-used dirt road, and I'd figured I'd walk there and back before returning home. Now, as I walked along the narrow road, the twigs and fallen leaves began crunching beneath my boots. There was just something so satisfying about that sound. But I felt this tingling sensation all over my body, like there was something wrong. And I noticed around me everything was quiet, and there was only the occasional rustle or a bird in the trees. I just felt this feeling of dread build up in me, and I found my eyes darting back and forth, trying to scan the tree lines for anything. Eager to shake off my nervousness and enjoy the last warmth of the day, I picked up my pace. I was about halfway there when something caught my ear. A strange noise, similar to the sound of scraping of nails on wood. I assumed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, so I paused for a moment, holding my breath. And there it was again, the unmistakable sound of something sharp scratching against a surface. I quickly looked around, trying my hardest to pinpoint the source as a sliver of fear slid down in my being. Very cautiously, I proceeded down the road, every so often hearing that same sound. It seemed to come from both behind and in front of me, as if taunting me to continue on. I began clenching my fists, determined not to run. In these woods, I reasoned it was probably just an animal or the wind playing with my nerves. But by the time I reached our family cabin, the sky had now turned to a deep indigo, and the first stars were beginning to emerge. I turned around, preparing for my trek back home, and as I stepped onto the road once more, the scratching noises suddenly stopped. I vividly remember exhaling, completely relieved, and hoped the silence would remain. Halfway back, however, it returned. That horrible, horrible noise returned, but this time it was louder and closer. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I frantically scanned the trees, searching for the origin of the noise. There in the distant glow of the porch light from a nearby home, I could see something. The faint silhouette of a figure, hunched over by the side of the road, scraping something against the ground. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it human? Was it animal? Was it some prankster trying to frighten a lone wanderer in a costume? So I decided to face it head on, gathering my courage. I picked up 2 small rocks and hurled them towards the figure, hoping to chase this person away. I held my breath, and for a moment the world around me had completely stopped. But then I heard the noise again, this time coming from above. I looked up and my heart sank, because there, high in the branches of a nearby spruce tree, I saw the figure. Its silhouette, at least. It was very distinct, and I could make out that it was clinging to the trunk, head tilted downwards toward me. Summoning all that I could, I yelled at this thing, challenging it to reveal itself. It turned its head towards me again, revealing eyes that seemed to glow with a red hue. My blood ran cold, and I swiftly retreated, not daring to look back. Well, safe to say that night went okay, but the next morning, I went back to investigate, hoping to find some sort of evidence or proof I could use to show that my nighttime encounter was real. But there was nothing. There was no tracks or signs of any kind, and to this day I've never quite understood who or what it was, but I've never wanted to face that again. I've told this story to a close family friend of mine who's actually a psychic. She informed me that it was a guardian, a demonic entity been placed here long ago by its old master to guard this area for any intruders, whatever that means. All I know is that that memory of me coming into contact with it will forever stay with me. Not to mention, I don't doubt for a second that that thing was evil. Back in 2001, I went to go visit my parents, who live in a more rural area in Alaska, roughly 100 miles east of Anchorage to be exact. My sister and I had an experience we'll never forget. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I feel the need to share this experience. Maybe if anyone has had something similar happen to them, we can find some sense of reassurance that we're not alone in whatever we experienced. We were staying in a small little makeshift cabin, located off a dirt road that winds through very dense foliage. There are no streetlights or any other source of light for miles around. It is incredibly dark and quiet at night, which is very peaceful. One evening, we're driving back after visiting my parents in town, and as we pull up, we could not shake the feeling that something was off. My sister did not seem to notice anything unusual, but I couldn't help the feeling. So we pulled up to our cabin, and we began unloading the car. I began to hear strange noises coming from right around the car. They didn't sound like your typical noises you'd expect to hear at night. These were different, practically unnatural. As I was carrying some bags inside, my sister stayed in the car to get our dogs ready. That's when she saw it, what she described as a hairless white humanoid crawling on all fours. She claimed it moved incredibly fast, darting in and out of the shadows. She screams out to me, asking if I could see it, but I could not. I turned to look in the direction she was pointing, and just as I did, we hear this horrifying screech. It was similar to a rabbit being killed by a predator. We both were completely adrenaline-filled and panicked, and we ran inside the cabin, locking the doors behind us. Once inside, we noticed that this thing, whatever it was, had followed us. It was now on our wooden porch, peering in through the glass window of the door. We quickly retreated to the bedroom, trying to figure out what to do. Now, my sister has some knowledge of Native American culture and suggested that we try to smudge the cabin with sage to ward it off. Well, we didn't have any sage on hand, but we did burn some dry herbs and prayed that it would be enough to protect us. Unfortunately, the only herb we had at the time was, well, you can guess where this is going. So hopefully that thing did not like the smell. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, locked in the bedroom, too afraid to venture out into the rest of the cabin. And every so often we would hear the tiniest, strangest noise outside, but neither of us were brave enough to look and see if it was still there. Eventually, exhaustion did take over, and we fell into a fitful sleep. Now, the following morning, we would assess the situation because we were figuring of just screwing it and just staying over with our parents. Well, we had found a handprint on the windows of the cabin and the car. They were unlike any handprints we'd ever seen. You could make out long, slender fingers with sharp claw-like nails. It was clear that whatever had visited us the night before was not normal. We spent the rest of the day just trying to ignore it and brush it off and drive back to our parents' place. Maybe it was possible that they would believe us and we could just hold up there. Well, as it turns out, we told our father, and he actually started telling us some stories of a Wendigo, which is a creature from the Algonquin folklore that's basically a malevolent spirit associated with cannibalism and insatiable hunger. Now, I don't know if what we saw was a Wendigo or really whatever it was, but our father really seemed fixated on the idea of that. And he also seemed even more fixated that we should try to get our money back from the cabin that we rented for the weekend. Anyway, the rest of the week with our parents went very well, and we had no other encounters with the Wendigo. But I'm more curious to know your thoughts. Do you think we encountered a Wendigo, or was this something else entirely?